Okay, so in this video, I want to go over a little bit about how weakness of the will is connected to hedonism, because the last video went over that pretty quickly. I also want to provide a sort of overall account of what the view of virtue is that Socrates is expressing in the Protagoras, or that Plato has Socrates express. Okay, weakness of the will, sometimes also referred to as incontinence, and in Greek, akrasia, is what happens when you conclude, when you believe. So in the first person case, or second person case, let's take an agent. Let's name that agent Mr. X. Right? Mr. X believes doing Y is best in some situation. Mr. X does Z, and Mr. X acts freely. So, what's going on in a case like this is, let's take the case that's very often used, diet, right? Let's say you've decided you're going to watch what you eat. You're going to cut sugar out of your diet, right? Sugar is not very good for you in large amounts. Good for you in small amounts, but whatever. Not good for you in large amounts, especially the kind of refined sugar we eat. Anyway, let's say you decide to cut that out of your diet. So you decide that eating foods with no added sugar is best. And then, a day or two into your diet, you find yourself late at night eating that peanut butter pie, right? And in violation of what you think is best. Now, a lot of times, you might think, well, when we decide something is best and then we don't do it, it's because we were forced to, right? Like if I decide me keeping my money is best, and then I find myself handing it over to the guy with the knife in the alley at night, well, that's not weakness of the will. That's a situation where I was coerced. I was forced to do something I didn't want to do. And so to make it weakness of the will, you have to add that you're doing it freely. So you freely do something you don't think is the right thing to do or the best thing to do. Your will is weak. Your will is the faculty that does the deciding. That's the idea. Right? Will is the part of you that makes decisions. And in this case, your will was not strong enough to make the decision in accordance with your judgment. Okay. So weakness of the will is something a lot of people believe in. It creates some complications for how we're supposed to think about how people make decisions, how people go about acting at all. Because it seems like, one way we describe weakness of the will is acting against our better judgment. Sometimes we describe it as being overcome. We have a plan, we have a goal, and then we feel as though we were internally overpowered by the desire, right, for Z. So very often it's common to say that it's a judgment, a value judgment in favor of Y. So a judgment involves our cognitive resources, right? We're not just feeling, we're thinking, but that it's a desire for Z where desire overrules your judgment. This is a very complicated subject. Plato is the first that we know of to talk about it. And the first place it comes up is here, where Plato says it doesn't exist. Now, this is one of the two major areas where the Protagoras stands out and where Plato has Socrates say things that are the exact opposite of what he has him say elsewhere. So this is the only dialogue in which Socrates endorses hedonism. Everywhere else that hedonism comes up, Plato has Socrates deny it. And as we'll see in the Republic, in this dialogue, where he denies that weakness of the will is possible. In the Republic, we see that he explicitly tries to explain how weakness of the will is possible. So what's going on here? Well, the idea is these two views, hedonism, which is the view that pleasure equals the good, and denial of weakness of the will fit together. And the way they fit together in the dialogue is this. Socrates brings up hedonism as a way to defend the unity of the virtues. Long-term goal is to defend the unity of the virtues because, as you remember from a couple videos ago, defending of the unity of the virtues is going to provide Plato a way to argue that you ought to be just, because the only way to have the self-regarding virtues of courage, temperance, and wisdom is to bring along with them justice and piety, the other regarding virtues, because in order to have one virtue, you have to have the others. Now, that's strictly speaking just reciprocity of the virtues, but Socrates wants to argue for the stronger view, the unity of the virtues. Hedonism is going to play a role in that, in a way I'll explain in a bit. The way denial of weakness of the will comes up is that Socrates considers a potential objection to hedonism, which is basically just the following. We obviously don't think pleasure is the good, because we sometimes think we're overcome by pleasure. The idea is our desire for Z, whatever Z is, in the case of my diet example, it was the peanut butter pie, the desire is a desire for pleasure. And it conflicts with the judgment that Y is what's good or what's valuable. If that's something that happens, if our desire for pleasure conflicts with our judgment about the good, then, and the desire for pleasure overpowers us, then Socrates thinks that would show that we don't believe hedonism. But Socrates' whole argument for hedonism is that everyone believes it. Right? He doesn't have any more sophisticated an argument than that. He says, look, if you actually look at how people behave, if you look at what people do, they're just pleasure seekers. They want to get pleasure, and they want to avoid pain. And that's really all there is to it. And we all basically agree to that. We all basically treat pleasure as good and pain as bad. But if this way of describing cases of weakness of will is right, then there's at least one case where we think pleasure and the good are different. Cases of weakness of the will, right? Where our desire for pleasure conflicts with our judgment about what's good. And so what Socrates says is, well, denial of or weakness of the will just doesn't happen. And there's a lot you could say in defense of this denial. I mean, after all, it sounds like you are fighting you when there's weakness of the will, and that you're overcoming yourself, which suggests there's like two separate sources of motivation inside you. And that seems difficult to understand. Like, there's just you. So who's fighting who, right? Who's getting overpowered? You might think, right, that what's really going on in weakness of the will is you claim you want to do Y. You claim that you think Y is best, but secretly you really just want Z. But when you describe to other people what's going on, when they're like, hey, why did you do Z? You say, oh, I knew it was wrong. I just couldn't help myself. You might think weakness of the will is a way of trying to avoid some kind of responsibility, trying to avoid like full ownership of your actions. You say, oh, I knew I should have done this, right? But I just, I felt so strongly the desire to do that. Right? This is the kind of thing that people who, cheat on their spouses will say, oh, I knew I should have stayed true to you, but, you were away and it was dark and it was nighttime and they were there and blah, 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 blah. So there's stuff you can say in favor of the idea that weakness of the will doesn't exist, right? It seems like you would have to come up with a fairly complicated picture of how human motivation works, where you have to have competing sources of motivation. And you'd have to explain like why there are competing sources of motivation within your mind. You have to explain, why it is that going one way counts as weakness, but the other way goes as strength. There's stuff you have to do. Plus, it seems like weakness of the will is sometimes a little fishy. Right? So the denial of weakness of the will is supposed to allow us to maintain hedonism, to believe that the good is just pleasure. And what we're going to see in the Republic is Plato ends up denying both of these. He doesn't draw the connection between them that tightly. He explicitly says weakness of the will is possible in the Republic. He doesn't come out quite as explicitly against hedonism, but it's very clear from what he says that he is not a fan of the idea that pleasure is what's good. Okay, so he denies weakness of the will in order to save hedonism. Why does he want to save hedonism? Well, because he has this idea. He has an idea about a fundamental definition of virtue. Right? So in the Protagoras only, virtue just is knowledge of the good. And the good is just pleasure. So virtue is knowledge of how to get pleasure. How to get as much pleasure over the course of your life as possible. That's all virtue is. Right? All those cardinal virtues, the self-regarding ones and the other-regarding ones, they are always of promoting your pleasure, of making your life go as good as possible by taking a reasonable and rational long-term view of what will give you the most pleasure over the course of your whole life. Every one of these virtues is just a way to do that. This connects up with things that Socrates actually seemed to believe. Socrates did actually seem to believe that virtue was a kind of knowledge. Now, it does conflict a little bit with the recurrent skepticism on Socrates' part that virtue can be taught, but Socrates does, in a lot of early dialogues, say that virtue is a kind of knowledge. And what Plato's doing is trying to figure out, okay, if it was knowledge, what would it be knowledge of? Well, knowledge of the good, right? Virtue is knowledge about how to do good things. Well, what are good things? Good things are pleasurable things. For you, the good is pleasure. And so being a virtuous person is just a matter of being the kind of person who can figure out what will lead to the most pleasure in your life and the least pain. We have a term for it that comes out of a much later period of human history, but the term is enlightened self-interest. We have associations, those of us who are familiar with the word, associations with the word hedonism, where hedonists are like gluttons, right? They overeat, they overdrink, right? They have like very promiscuous sexual practices, things like that. But what Socrates is going to say, or says in the Protagoras, is, well, that's a person who's bad at being a hedonist, right? Because they eat lots of delicious, rich foods, and then they get gout, and then they're in pain the rest of their lives. They're sexually wild in their youth, and they get STDs, and then they're in pain the rest of their lives, and also they die young, right? They drink themselves silly, give themselves liver damage, and die young, right? Things like that. But a person who was intelligent about it, a person who was wise, right, would know that you need to pace yourself. So a person who is wise would be temperate. A person who is wise would also realize you need the help of other people in order to achieve the most possible pleasure in your life and the least pain. And they would know that the only reliable way to achieve or get that cooperation from other people is to treat them in certain ways, to treat them as you would like to be treated. Right? And of course, a person who has enlightened self-interest isn't going to be the kind of person who backs down to every threat, but they're also not going to be the kind of person who resists every threat. They will be appropriately resistant to fear, but they won't be rash, so they'll have courage. On this way of thinking about things, virtue is of purely instrumental value. Virtue is something you want so that you can get something else. That something else is pleasure. So virtue is not valuable in itself. on the way of thinking expressed in the Protagoras. This basic view, the basic view of the Protagoras, would go on to be a view that lots of people in the ancient world would hold. Something like this view was held by Epicurus. A couple generations after Plato, Epicurus was a major thinker who had tremendous influence and still does have tremendous influence. In fact, his name became a word. Epicurean kind of is like hedonist. It's just about food. We're not going to talk about Epicurus in this class, unfortunately. Can't go too in depth in a survey class. But this view would have a lot of influence, despite the fact that it appears that Plato's own reaction to figuring out what it would take to make Socrates' ethical views consistent was to say, well, then I'm just going to have to disagree with Socrates. Because this does make good sense of things Socrates said, right? The idea that virtue is a kind of knowledge, that's something Socrates seemed to be committed to. The idea of the unity of the virtues, this makes sense of that, right? The virtues are all just knowledge of what's good and how to get it in different kinds of circumstances. The idea that people only do the wrong thing through ignorance or unwillingly, that's expressed in the Apology. Well, that fits with this, right? If you're doing the wrong thing, if you're that guy who, drinks himself silly, it's you're doing the wrong thing, you're acting intemperately, but you're only doing it because you don't understand that it's in your personal self-interest long term to not go to those excesses. Right? All vice is a kind of ignorance, all virtue is a kind of knowledge. These were things that Socrates thought. And that makes sense of how Socrates lived his life. He seemed to think, he expresses this in the Apology, that being virtuous is just a matter of gaining knowledge. Right? If we figure out what the virtues are, we'll be able to be good people because of it. It's a very intellectual account of ethics. Right? All that's required to be a good moral person is to have the right kinds of knowledge, and you'll just do the right thing. That's what Socrates seemed to think, right? If you knew what the good was, you would do what was right. You would never suffer weakness of will, right? Weakness of will is the kind of thing that could get in the way of someone who knew what the right thing was to do from doing it. But Socrates says, no, that doesn't happen. If you genuinely know what the right thing to do is, you're going to do it. And hedonism makes sense of that, because according to Socrates and the Protagoras, the right thing to do is just to do the thing that promotes your own pleasure. And of course you're going to want to promote your own pleasure. Right? But what Plato's going to decide is, nope, if that's what Socrates thought, or if that's the answer to all of Socrates' questions, is hedonism, then Plato doesn't want to agree with Socrates. I want to be clear here. Socrates never says these things. We have no evidence that Socrates believed these things himself. The Protagoras is probably best thought of as Plato's attempt to give a kind of theoretical coherence to Socrates' views. But once he has that coherent theory, he's going to ditch it in favor of the theory in the Republic, along with some other dialogues, but we'll be looking at the Republic. All right, that's it for this video, and that's it for the Protagoras. I only ended up making 3 videos rather than 4, although a couple of them were a little long.